Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm going to be talking about part of an ongoing study looking into the roles of precipitation and potential top-down control in structuring Texas's coastal streamfish communities. So we're all well aware that the global climate is undergoing significant changes, temperature rise probably being the most commonly thought of, but precipitation patterns have been changing as well, and this is forecasted to continue. Some areas like the Arctic and equatorial regions are getting wetter, and in other areas, deserts are spreading and climates are becoming more arid. It's also important to point out that the magnitudes and frequencies of precipitation-related events, like severe storms and droughts, are also increasing. Rivers and streams, or lotic systems, can be uniquely sensitive to changes in precipitation patterns, but how biological communities respond to these changes isn't necessarily well understood. The factors shaping lotic community structure that have received most of the attention in the literature are hydrologic regimes and the environmental constraints they present, as well as resources at the bases of food webs driving things through bottom-up control. The effect of predators and top-down control in streams has been much less studied, but there is some evidence for this in the literature, and if it is operating in lotic systems, it may also have an important tie to climate change. So relating each of these factors to precipitation regime, the main expectation in terms of hydrology is that some streams or rivers under more arid climates, flows are generally more stochastic and become increasingly more stable under wetter climates. More stochastic flows means more disturbance stress on taxa, which leads to communities that are more heavily filtered by these types of environmental constraints. With more stable flow regimes under wetter climates, disturbance stress is lower, and this is expected to lead to more diverse communities and more complex food webs. In terms of resources driving community structure, a major process at work here has to do with the vegetation that watersheds and riparian zones under different precipitation regimes can support. Moving from arid to humid climates, this vegetation becomes more extensive, allowing less light to penetrate to the water's surface and decreasing in-stream primary production, but increasing the allochthonous inputs to the stream. And this is predicted to result in both increased diversity of basal resources and more temporally stable resource availability, with in-stream production being aided by that extra supply of allochthonous carbon. Ultimately then, these resource dynamics can drive more stable and diverse primary consumer communities, and the effect cascades to higher trophic levels from the bottom up. So top-down control, once again, has received much less attention in terms of how it might be operating in lotic systems, and especially as it relates to climate. So there's really three key pieces of evidence to suggest that this is something we might actually want to be looking into. First, it has been demonstrated in some studies that top-down processes can have significant effects in shaping lotic communities. It's also been shown that the strengths of top-down processes can be influenced by changes in environmental variables. And third, in general, more stable systems are expected to support more predators. And this is something we can measure in terms of their abundance, biomass, production, and the pressure they exert on lower trophic levels. So given these expectations, through top-down control, this would result in lower prey abundance and biomass, and through an alternating cascade effect down to basal trophic levels, ultimately lead to more complex food webs under wetter climates. So is this link between climate, in this case precipitation and hydrologic stability, predators, and top-down control strength driving lotic community structure? One way for us to test these predictions is to take advantage of existing spatial climate gradients and look at things from a space per time perspective. So for this study, we utilized the Texas coastal plain, which is really an ideal region for this kind of study, as it's home to the sharpest rainfall gradient in North America that doesn't correspond with a change in elevation or temperature. Annual rainfall more than doubles over an area of less than 200 miles. And we chose 9 streams here, more or less evenly spaced across the gradient. And in addition to having USGS streamflow gauges, they also share several other important properties, water temperature being a big one, which is important if we want to isolate precipitation-related effects from other confounding variables. So to address this question of whether or not our study system shows evidence for climate-mediated top-down control, we essentially want to know, is top-down control operating, and if so, is it increasing in strength with increasing precipitation? So today I'm going to be focusing on fish communities, since that's trophically where the top predators are in these systems, and basically looking at this first step. Are these predator variables related to precipitation regime? And then I'll also touch on something related to what might be going on at the next lowest trophic level, at least in terms of the fishes. So to figure out what predators and fish communities look like, we conducted several electrofishing surveys between 2017 and 2020 within blocked off 75-meter reaches of each stream and used depletion curves to estimate total abundance of each species. And all in all, we caught over 22,000 individuals from 50 different species. And subsets of each species were also measured before they were released so we can calculate things like biomass and secondary production. The definition I'm going to be using for a predator here is an obligate carnivore with diets that include piscivory at some life stage. So anything that's an omnivore or a strict invertivore is not included. And this was based on functional traits data, which relies on setting up species by trait matrices. And this is just a small snippet of a trait matrix that I used. I assigned species in the data set with trait values in a number of categories, including diet, which is the obviously important one here. So then, based on the predator definition above, we can see what species to focus on, which for our data included 13 species with just over 1,000 individuals that were caught. Aside from things we can calculate from species abundance and length data, we also ran a prey tethering experiment to estimate the amount of pressure these predators exert in these communities. This involved taking several fiberglass rods and attaching pieces of monofilament line with small hooks on one end and anchoring the other ends into the substrate. On a third of these tethers were large prey or previously frozen silversides, another group with small prey or previously frozen guppies, and another group with just bare hooks to serve as controls. And these were placed haphazardly within each stream reach and removed after 25 minutes. So if at least half of a prey item had been removed, we consider that consumption and ultimately measured predation pressure as the percentage of prey consumed per unit time, or per minute in this case. So on to some results. Everything in the next few slides are regressions against mean annual rainfall, with predators shown in red and whole fish communities shown in blue. So as you can see, predators appear to become more abundant with rainfall, while the whole fish communities show the opposite trend, that is, they decrease in abundance with rainfall. And for reference, the pie chart here shows the proportion of predators to non-predators across these communities. So again, predators are a pretty small fraction of the whole community numerically. For biomass and production, we've got the mean standing stock of fish biomass per square meter on the left and mean secondary production here on the right. And these trends, unlike abundance, are mostly showing non-significant relationships, with the exception of fish community production decreasing with rainfall. Results from the prey tethering experiments do show that predation pressure increases significantly with rainfall in terms of large, small, and total prey consumed. So circling back to this original question, are the predator variables related to precipitation? We did see some of these predicted relationships. Abundance and predation pressure appear to increase with rainfall. But we didn't see that in regard to biomass and production. So one reason as to why this was the case may have something to do with the quality of basal food resources. This lower right plot shows diatom data we collected over the course of the study, which are important basal food resources in these communities, and they show a decreasing trend in density with rainfall. These in-stream producers are a much more bioavailable food source than allogenous materials like dead leaves or woody debris. So if primary consumers are at the drier sites are more reliant on these higher quality food sources, the effect may be cascading from the bottom up through food webs and be somewhat responsible for the patterns we see here with fish biomass and production. Now going back to the second question of how whole fish communities, which again are mostly comprised of potential prey species, reflect the relationships we saw between predators and rainfall. So there's a couple things I want to point out from the fish abundance data that may be important for the precipitation-mediated top-down control hypothesis. First, predator and total fish abundances covary. In other words, when predator abundance increases or decreases between sites, whole fish communities are doing the opposite in several cases. And when we plot predator abundance against whole community abundance, there's a pretty strong correlation. So this tight link between predators and whole communities or potential prey suggests that top-down control may be operating in several of these systems. And then second, the general trend, as you saw in the earlier slide, is that predators increase and whole fish communities decrease in abundance with decreasing rainfall. So if top-down control is operating, these relationships might suggest that it's increasing in strength with increasing rainfall, which is what was expected. Moving forward, these are a couple more immediate steps I'll be looking into with the goal of making what I show today more specific and hopefully more accurate. Breaking predators down into size class is going to be important. For many species like these channel catfish, diets are likely going to see some big shifts with ontogeny, so not all size classes within a given species are really performing that top predator role in the same way. And isolating prey species from whole fish communities is also going to be important, as well as separating those into size classes. And finally, the much more ultimate step for this work is building out whole food webs for each of these streams, starting with hypothesized models and then informing them with real data, which we've collected in many forms and from many sources. We're working on stable isotope data for entire communities from fish down to primary producers, fish stomach contents to get sort of these ground truth snapshots of exactly what these things are eating. We've got some really extensive macrovertebrate community data sets, and we've also quantified basal food resources in a number of ways. Ultimately, we're generating a lot of data to draw from here, so we should be able to make some great food web models from these systems and really get a multifaceted sense of how trophic controls are operating with regard to precipitation regime. So with that, we'd like to thank all of the lab employees and volunteers who've helped to make this project possible, and of course NSF for their ongoing support. Thanks again for tuning in.